All right, tonight we're going to cap off looking at the kingdom of Judah. We've been looking at the kings all the way back from Saul. Tonight we're going to really be focusing on a guy named Josiah and how it still ends up leading to the downfall of Judah. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen just so we can kind of get a picture of where we've been and where we are. So we're going to be focusing on this guy, Josiah. We're going to see briefly his kids and grandkids. Remember, the United Kingdom was with David, Solomon, Saul. But we're going to be focusing on Josiah. But almost 300 years before Josiah was when the kingdom split. You had the northern kingdom of Israel, and their first king was Jeroboam the first. Remember, he's the guy who set up Dan and Bethel, the places of false worship, when they initially split off from Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And he's in Bethel, and one of the places to worship these idols. And the king, Jeroboam, he's making offerings. In 1 Kings chapter 13, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of Yahweh to Bethel. And Jeroboam was standing by the altar making offerings. The man cried against the altar by the word of Yahweh, saying, O altar, thus says Yahweh, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name. And he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, This is a sign that Yahweh has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out. We're going to see that prophecy fulfilled almost 300 years ago in King Josiah. We're going to be looking from the chronicler's perspective tonight. That's Pew Bible page 453 if you're using that red Pew Bible in front of you. We're looking at King Josiah. 2 Chronicles 34. We'll hit some highlights in 35 and 6. But we're going to start 2 Chronicles 34. Again, that's page 453 in that red Pew Bible. He's kind of Judah's last hope, and we're going to see he's not just a good king. We could put the word really good in front of Josiah, as we're going to see. Let's take a look at verses 1 and 2. Josiah, he is only 8 years old when he began to reign. He does reign 31 years in Jerusalem. He did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh. He walked in the ways of David his father. We've heard that phrase before, but notice this phrase. He did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. We're going to see here in the chronicler's account tonight a ton of quotations or obvious allusions to the book of Deuteronomy. We'll find out why here in a second as well. It's in a few places in Deuteronomy, but where this is also quoted is Deuteronomy 17. Okay, for those of you who've been here through the series, remember Deuteronomy 17 talks about what the king should do. They shouldn't put their trust in multiplying wives, and that way they would go after idols. Stay away from that. Or horses or gold and riches. Don't trust in your power. And at the end of that, in verse 18 in Deuteronomy 17, talks about they have to have the own book of the law. In verse 19, the king's supposed to read it every day, all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God by keeping all the words of his law. Verse 20, the reasoning, so he's not arrogant, that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or the left. So the author here in 2 Chronicles 34, verse 2, it's definitely alluding here to Deuteronomy 17:20, that this king is following what he's supposed to be doing according to the law of the Lord. And in the 8th year of his reign, so he's a teenager, 16 or so, while he's yet a boy, he begins to seek the God of David, his father. He begins to purge the land of idols. We've seen this happen before in the history of Israel, and particularly Judah, purging the land. And then in verse 4, he's chopping down altars again. He's standing above them. He broke in pieces the Asherah, remember that deity, that goddess. He carved metal images that torn down. I like this. He made dust of these idols, and he scattered it over the graves of those who'd sacrificed to them, to the priests, to these so-called gods. I referenced on the screen in chapter 33, verse 15 of this book, Manasseh took idols and threw them out of Jerusalem, which was a very good thing. He was commended. Josiah takes the idols and turns them into dust. And makes me think of like what Zach talked about this last Wednesday about not leaving a foothold for the devil, or Jesus said, take out your eye if it causes you to sin. This is total commitment to the Lord his God. Keep working on here to verse 5. Here's prophecy fulfilled that we just read in 1 Kings 13:2. Josiah also burned the bones of the priests on their altars. So the priests who dedicated their lives to these false deities are disgraced. Again, it's kind of smack talk, if you will. and prophecies fulfilled. That was told to Jeroboam almost 300 years ago. As well as, starting in verse 6, notice where the cities are now. He's not just in Judah, Manasseh, Ephraim, Simeon, as far as Naphtali. These are areas around the Sea of Galilee. He broke down altars, beat Asherim and the images into powder. There's the idols to dust again. He cuts down all the incense altars throughout all the land of Israel. That was the sign in 1 Kings 13:3. He'd tear down the altars, scatter the ash, and he returns to Jerusalem. He must restore the temple. So there's prophecy fulfilled, always a cool thing. But like I just mentioned, Manasseh, Ephraim, that's what was the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember, it split under Rehoboam, and then Israel went, away because of the Assyrians. The blue side, the right side, is what it was under David, the united kingdom. It's almost as if the kingdom's kind of like being reunited again, because Josiah's going all the way up here. He has control all up to the Sea of Galilee, tearing down idols there. It also tells us historically, we know this extra biblically as well, that the Assyrians' grip on the ancient Near East is beginning to waver. They're not as strong as they were in the days of Hezekiah and so on. Picking up here back at verse 8, in the 18th year of his reign, when Josiah had cleansed the land of the house, he sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, Maaseiah, the governor of the city, and Joah, the son of Jehoahaz, the recorder, to repair the house of Yahweh his God. We saw this with Hezekiah, right? History's repeating itself. I'm sure between Manasseh and his son Ammon, I'm sure they didn't very much so take great care of the temple. There's probably lots to clean up. Let's skip down to verse 14. They're bringing money out of the temple, and they're back in some of the storage facilities of the temple. And Hilkiah the priest, in verse 14, found a book of the law of Yahweh given through Moses. I should have changed it on the screen. I don't like that it says book. It should say scroll, but I do like the ESV. But think of a scroll. They find a scroll back there, and we're going to see this scroll is likely Deuteronomy. Could have included more, sure, but we're going to see the quotations are all out of Deuteronomy. A great chance that Ammon and Manasseh either destroyed or hid books of the law. They obviously were not interested in the things of Yahweh until later in Manasseh's life, at least for him, when he repented. But we're going to see these guys, they bring the book to the king. And if you skip down there in verse 18, Shaphan tells the king Josiah, Hilkiah the priest, he's given me a scroll, and he read it before the king. I don't know if he's sitting kind of leisurely or he's in his throne room. I don't know how much he hears, but he reads this scroll, the law of the Lord, to King Josiah. Okay, verse 19, here's Josiah's reaction. When the king heard the words of the law, he tore his clothes. Okay, this is something else we've seen, right? This is deep mourning in that culture because he's realizing the sins of his people, the sins of Judah. And he's going to tell us straight up what he is afraid of. Look at verse 21. He tells his leaders, go inquire of Yahweh for me. Usually that means go find the prophet. And for those who are left in Israel and Judah concerning the words of the book. That's the book we just found. For great is the, here's a theme we're going to see in the lesson tonight, wrath of Yahweh. And wrath, we're going to see this theme, is poured out on us. Why? Because our fathers have not kept the word of Yahweh to do according to all that is written in this book. We read it out of Psalm 116. Jess read it when we're in distress. We've seen it in David. We've seen it in Manasseh, Hezekiah. You seek the Lord your God. But why do you think Josiah is totally convinced that we're in trouble? That's his response here. He's like, wrath is being poured on us by our God. We're not in good standing with the Lord. We don't have time to go through all of these, but in Deuteronomy 27 and 28, there are a plethora of curses that God promises and kind of prophesies of if you go down this way of continual disobedience, these are the things that will happen to you. Things like curses, like what you saw with the plagues of Egypt, like that bad type of stuff. Deuteronomy 27:26, cursed be anyone who does not confirm the words of this law by doing them. The people are supposed to agree. Amen, right? That's truth. Deuteronomy 28, look at verses 52 and 3. He says that your enemies, right, if you disobey the Lord, they'll besiege your towns. Even your fortified walls, these things in which you trusted, they're going to come down throughout your whole land. They shall besiege you in all your towns and all your land, which Yahweh your God has given you. In verse 53, you shall eat the fruit of your womb, the flesh of your sons and daughters, whom Yahweh your God has given you, in the siege and distress in which your enemy shall distress you. Right? We talked about that with Hezekiah. When you're starved out in a city, surrounded by an army, people turn to cannibalism in their desperation. He's saying, this sort of horrific actions are going to come upon you if you continually disobey the Lord. This is terrifying to hear. Picture Josiah listening to this. Or how about this, verses 64 and 5, that Yahweh will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you'll serve other gods of wood and stone that neither you or your fathers have known. You'll find in these nations no respite. There'll be no resting place for the sole of your foot. Yahweh will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and a languishing soul. If you're King Josiah and you're hearing things like this, I can see why he believes the wrath of God is on us. He can look at history, and he can also be afraid of what could come in the future. His reaction is humility. He tears his clothes upon hearing this. It's realizing sin is a curse, and that they rightfully stand condemned before a holy and righteous God. Josiah seeks that same God, though. So verse 22, Hilkiah, he goes and finds Huldah, the prophetess. So we got a female prophet here, the wife of Salom, son of Tahath, son of Hasrar, keeper of the wardrobe. They lived in the second quarter. They spoke to her in that effect. So her husband is either working for the priests or the king's wardrobe, but it's a prophetess. I believe this is the only prophetess mentioned in 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings, or Chronicles. I think the last female prophet was Deborah, I think back in Judges chapter 4. I think that's the last one. So that's notable. They probably tell her the things to that effect, the last part of that sentence. Hey, we realize us and our fathers have been disobedient, and that all these curses, some of the ones we just read, like starvation and sieges and wars and cannibalism and plagues and exile, those things could happen to us. They're seeking her. She is the prophetess of Yahweh at this time. And she says, starting in verse 24, thus says Yahweh, behold, I will bring disaster upon this place and its inhabitants. All the curses that are written in the book that was read before the king of Judah. And this is very bad news. Because they've forsaken me, they've made offerings to other gods, that they provoked me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore, my wrath will be poured out on this place, and it will not be quenched. This is awful news. You're kind of hoping for some good news from the prophetess of Yahweh to say, here's what you can do. And here it's saying, nope, this is set in stone. And Kings talked about that. Part of that was Manasseh. But, you keep reading, verse 26, but suggests a different fate for Josiah. To the king of Judah, sent you to inquire of Yahweh. You'll say this to him, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, regarding the words that you've heard, because your heart was tender, and you humbled yourself before God when you heard his words, right, the law, against this place and its inhabitants, and you have humbled yourself before me, and have torn your clothes and wept before me, I also have heard you, declares Yahweh. So, same is true today. God hears us in our repentant tears. We've seen this with Hezekiah, even Manasseh, the worst of the worst. This is a constant theme in the book of Chronicles, to humble ourselves before the Lord our God. Constant theme that's been pointed out again and again. And she continues in verse 28. She says, behold, speaking for God, God says, I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace. Your eyes are not going to see the disaster I'll bring upon this place and its inhabitants. And they brought that word back to King Josiah. I have it referenced on the screen. Found this very interesting. This archaic expression, gather to your fathers, is only used of the patriarchs like Abraham and his family, and of Aaron and Moses. That's it. Which means Josiah is the only king who gets this phrase. Not even David, the man after God's own heart, gets this notability. And we're going to see as it goes along how great the author of Chronicles believes Josiah to be. He's an amazing and godly king. He's the only king who receives this archaic expression. The mercy's clear. Josiah's like the best of the best that we've seen when it comes to the kings. Okay, skip down to verse 30. Josiah goes up to the house of Yahweh. He's called the leaders in verse 29. All the men of Judah, all the people of Jerusalem, priests, Levites, great and small. This is everyone. And he, that's Josiah, the king, picture him there with the scroll. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of Yahweh. So this is kind of, you're going to begin this idea of renewing their covenant in the next verse. It's a public reading of Scripture. Think about it. Most of them didn't have a Bible, so to say, sitting around in their house. This is why synagogue became so important. That's where you learn to study the Word. You heard it. You heard it. Very different from us today. Of course, we should still be studying our Bibles. This is an interesting thing to think about. And he goes on to say in verse 31, the king stood in his place. He's renewing this covenant before Yahweh and the people to keep all the commandments. But notice this, with all his heart and all his soul to perform the words of the covenant that were written in this book. Can you think of anywhere else, famously, in the book of Deuteronomy that uses language like this, with all your heart and all your soul? The Shema. We're going to be talking about this tomorrow on the Extra Mile podcast, Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5. Shema, hear, listen. Shema, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh's one. You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul. I think 2 Chronicles 34:31 is playing on that, with all your heart and soul. Because if you love the Lord, you'll keep his commandments. That's what we're seeing here with Josiah. And it's straight out of Deuteronomy chapter 6. To love the Lord with all your heart, to love him is to obey him, right? Jesus talks about that as well. And then back to our text in verse 32. He made all who were present in Jerusalem join in this covenant. So kings like like Jeroboam, too many J's, kings like Jeroboam, they make the people sin, right? They lead in idolatry. Versus Josiah, he makes the people commit. He leads them to committing their life to the Lord. He is a godly leader, man, and king. He continues to tear down idols in verse 33. And the people, they didn't turn away from following the Lord all of Josiah's days. Okay, that's an important highlight. All his days, they didn't turn away from following Yahweh, the God of their fathers. But if you think that's good, the story for Josiah only gets better, right? He's the best of the best. Chapter 35, verse 1 of 2 Chronicles. Josiah kept a Passover to Yahweh in Jerusalem, and they slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the first month. There are many passages about Passover, but Deuteronomy 16 is where you find the list of stipulations, and it seems like that's the book he found in the temple. So that's probably where he read this. Hey, this is when we're supposed to do this. This is what it's supposed to look like. We'll talk about this Passover in just another minute when it comes up again. Fun historical thing in verse 3. He tells the Levites who taught all Israel, who were holy to Yahweh, put the holy ark, that's the Ark of the Covenant, in the house of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, the one that he built. You don't need to carry it around on your shoulders, which makes me wonder, why is the ark out? If you guys have a better idea, tell me. The only thing I could think of why the ark was out was maybe it was when they were knocking down idols and stuff in the northern region. They brought the ark out, kind of like the military campaigns back in like the days of Joshua. I don't know. But he tells them, put it back in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. And by the way, this is the last place we know historically in Scripture where the ark is. It just vanishes after this. I'm in the camp that thinks the Babylonians take it, but who knows what happened. There's all sorts of bizarre theories, including one that the Ark of the Covenant is in Ireland. That's right, Ireland. It wasn't very reputable. But we don't know where it is. It's probably not your Indiana Jones movie either. I think in Revelation it's in heaven. Maybe God took it. I don't know. But this is the last place, verse 3 of 2 Chronicles 35, that we know of where the ark is historically. There's many ideas. There was other ideas like Jeremiah took it to Sinai, all sorts of extra biblical stuff. We just don't know. So Josiah, though, he's going to go through the Levitical divisions like David. He's organizing the temple. He contributes for all the people. Skip down to verse 12 of 2 Chronicles 35. All the people, they set aside these burnt offerings, but I want to look at, I have it highlighted on the screen. Look, they offer these things to Yahweh as it is written in the book of Moses, verse 12. Verse 13, they roasted the Passover lamb with fire according to the rule. Look how closely and carefully Josiah and the people are following the law. They're clearly reading it. They're sticking close to it because they love the Lord their God. They've seen history. They know what could happen in the future. Like, we need to be careful in our obedience, unlike Manasseh, who was definitely not careful, at least to start. And then verse 18, look at this, important verse. 35:18. No Passover like it had been kept in Israel since the days of Samuel the prophet. None of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as was kept by Josiah. Chapter 30, verses 2 and 3, you might be thinking, hey, didn't Hezekiah do a Passover? Yes, he did, and he was commended for it. We didn't talk about it much, but Hezekiah's was a month later than prescribed in the law because the priests weren't sanctified yet. He wasn't condemned for it, but he's saying Josiah, he's following the law closely. He's doing everything that the Lord his God would have him do. And I have it highlighted. There hadn't been a Passover like it since the days of Samuel. That's like the era borderline of the judges. He was the last judge. That's over 400 years ago. It's kind of sad. It's been like 400 years since Passover was really kept. And we're going to read it at the end too. Think about it. Have you heard much about the Sabbath a lot in the Kings? Have you heard about the year of Jubilee? No. Like, there's not a lot of good stuff that's been going on through these details. There hadn't been a Passover since the days of Samuel. That's amazing. Again, the emphasis, Josiah's the best king we've seen. And it feels like at this point he could be the king. And he's got everything going for him. He's the guy. He's the man. There's been no Passover like it. He's reforming Israel, turns the idols to dust. He's like brought back the old kingdom. It's almost united in a sense. Keep going down to verse 20. After all this, okay, when Josiah had prepared the temple, he goes up against Necho, king of Egypt. Necho's going up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates. Josiah goes out to fight him. That's what it means by to meet him. This thing's kind of falling off. So we know this biblically and extra-biblically of what happens here. So the Egyptians down here, the Assyrians up here, the Babylonians are kind of off the screen. But the Babylonians are becoming a threat in the world. They're the new world power. So the Assyrians and the Egyptians decide to team up. I'm guessing Josiah felt threatened, because you can tell geographically he's wedged between Assyria and Egypt. That's not good news for you. If they team up against you, you're going to get crushed, obviously. So he thinks he needs to stop this. We're going to see this battle here in Megiddo. Let's keep reading in verse 21. So Pharaoh sends envoys to Josiah, saying, what have we to do with each other, king of Judah? Because he's just trying to pass through the area. I'm not coming against you this day, but against the house of which I'm at war. And God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God who is with me, lest he destroy you. Pretty bold words and surprising words that come out of the mouth of Pharaoh. Now, to be fair, we've heard foreign nations and foreign kings who were commissioned by Yahweh to go and do things. So it's not like we haven't heard of this before. He seems to be saying it's the God of Israel, right? The Lord, Yahweh. But whatever it is, Josiah's not having it, and we realize that's the problem, actually. Look at verse 22. Nevertheless, Josiah didn't turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho, notice this, from the mouth of God. But he came to fight in the plain of Megiddo. So from the mouth of God, the author is obviously saying, inspired, saying, this was the Lord speaking. Josiah should have listened. Think of it. Josiah listened when he heard the law of Moses being read to him. Josiah listened to God's prophetess and the woman Huldah. He listened to her. He's been listening to God. Here he does not listen. Okay? And by the way, think about this. You think of another king who disguised himself? And by the way, in the plain of Megiddo, that is, if you zoom in, so where this battle is, kind of in the northern region, if you zoom in on that, this is the Jezreel Valley. Can you think of someone else who was notable, who had a second palace by a nice vineyard in the city of Jezreel? And not only that, you keep reading, the archers shoot Josiah. And he says to his servants, take me away, I'm badly wounded. So his servants took him out of the chariot, carried him in a second chariot, and brought him to Jerusalem. And he died in Jerusalem. He's buried in the tomb with his fathers, and all Judah and Jerusalem, they mourn for Josiah. Even in verse 25, the great prophet Jeremiah mourns for him. He was a godly king. He was the best. But who else disguises himself? Who else is shot by an arrow and says, "Take me away," and dies in his capital city? It's obviously and shockingly Ahab, the worst of the worst. And yet the best of the best dies like the worst of the worst. What is the message here that's being sent by the author? This is shocking. When Manasseh was compared to Ahab, that made sense. I know Manasseh repented, but Manasseh was awful. Awful. And when he was compared to Ahab, you're like, yeah, you belong in that camp. These allusions, Josiah, now don't get the Bible mistaken. Obviously Josiah was a godly man. But there's again this painting of there hasn't been a good or perfect king, has there? Everyone lacks the glory of God, even the most righteous of men. Very disturbing. It's an ominous ending to the story of Josiah, is it not? And for good reason. God has said, "My wrath will be poured out." Josiah has a son, Jehoahaz. He only rules for 3 months. This is starting in chapter 36, verses 1 through 4. Necho, we just saw him. Pharaoh forces him to pay tribute, yanks him out. Necho takes his brother, Eliakim, changes his name to Jehoiakim, and he puts in a new king, probably because his brother would be more loyal to Egypt. But he takes Jehoahaz captive to Egypt. That's the last we hear of him. All right, how about his brother? I go to verses 4 through 8 of chapter 36. His brother reigns for 11 years. But it says in verse 5, he did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. And now Babylon's the ruler. King Nebuchadnezzar takes him captive to Babylon. And Neb, as I so lovingly call him because I'm out of room in verse 7, Neb takes the vessels of the temple. This king, Jehoiakim, he committed abominations like all the other nations. But he's taken to Babylon, and unlike Manasseh, he does not return from Babylon. Okay, his son is pretty much the same name, Jehoiakim. People say Chin, but he reigned 3 months, 10 days. He too does what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. Nebuchadnezzar also takes him captive to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar then takes more vessels from Jerusalem and the temple. And one of these two raids, it seems like that's when that's when Daniel and his friends were taken. And one of these two raids is what it seems like when you put those books together. Okay, he gets taken out. Nebuchadnezzar replaces him with his brother, Zedekiah. Zedekiah is the last king of Judah. He reigns 11 years, but he too does what is evil in the eyes of Yahweh. This is now a grandson of Josiah, right? He rebels against the prophet Jeremiah. He rebels against King Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonians are on top. And he leads the entire nation to unfaithfulness in verse 14. They commit the same sins and abominations that Manasseh and the nations that were there before even the conquest of Joshua and the promised land. And yet, look at verses 15 and 16 of chapter 36. Look what God is still doing. Yahweh, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers because he had compassion on his people. But this is sad. They kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words, scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of Yahweh rose against his people, and there was no remedy. It's depressing. We've seen this play out again and again. Think about the patience of God. They're in their last leg here. We're moments from their exile, and he's still sending them prophets saying, "Return to me, return to me." And they mock him for it. I'm going to read verses 17 through 21 of 2 Chronicles 36. Therefore God brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, right? Nebuchadnezzar. He killed their young men with the sword, even in the house of their sanctuary. He had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, all the vessels of the temple, great and small, the treasures of the house of Yahweh, and the treasures of the king of his princes. All this he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God, the temple. They broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that lay desolate it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Wrath is being poured out. It's an unthinkable sight. Zion, the city of David, the temple to the God Most High, burned to the ground. It's kind of like there in verse 21, as I just mentioned, if you won't keep my law, if you won't take a Sabbath, which is for your own good, I'll make you take a Sabbath. And off they go into exile. Wrath is poured out. In the book of Kings, Zedekiah escapes. He runs away to the plains of Jericho. He's captured. He's forced to watch his sons be killed in front of him and then have his eyes gouged out. It's the last thing Zedekiah sees. It's a horrific ending to the story. To all these kings, here's where the line of David is ended. Here, in total destruction. Just in case there's any confusion as we begin to wrap up, this is the timeline that we've been looking at. We saw Josiah, roughly 640 BC. The discovery of the Book of Law, roughly 622. But then 609 is when Pharaoh killed Josiah in battle. And then we've seen two different invasions from the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. Somewhere between 605 and 597 is when Daniel would have been taken. And then it's 586, maybe 587 BC. That's the final, just total destruction and annihilation of Jerusalem. All of it is essentially destroyed, plundered, burned to the ground. Even the temple, like we just read. Pretty sad. And then check this out from the book of Kings. So there's people left over from the exile. Who knows what awful things they've seen? And they look around. They're scared of the Babylonians. Where do they go? Egypt. That's another notable place in Israel's history, is it not? So I got a large part of the group is in Babylon. Is pretty close to Babylon. That's the same area. Is where Abraham was called out of, right? When he was Abram in Genesis 12. Egypt, obviously, is where God rescued his people out of slavery from Pharaoh. Okay, do you see the narrative theme here? The story has started all over. We're back where Abram was called from. We're back where God called his people out of slavery. We're back to square one. Like, now what? Look what has happened. It's starting all over, and you're thinking, well, what about the promises to Abraham, the nation, the one who blessed all the nations? What about the messianic promise to David, the eternal king who reigns forever? What about that? If you were in exile, you just got to be thinking, even if you're Daniel, you're like, where's God? Well, this is punishment. But at the same time, you'd be thinking, God's faithful. He never breaks his word. Where are the promises to Abraham and to David? Remember in the days of Hezekiah and Manasseh, there was the prophet Isaiah. Prophet Isaiah, he said a lot about the downfall of Judah, that it was coming. Such as Isaiah 51, verse 17. Wake yourself, stand up, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of Yahweh the cup of his wrath, who have drunk to the dregs the bowl, the cup of his staggering. They've had so much wrath, they're painted as a drunkard who's had way too much to drink. That you've gulped down the wrath of the Lord. This is what we just saw fulfilled with Nebuchadnezzar taking Judah into captivity. And yet, in this same context, Isaiah gives hope of what is to come. Chapter 52, verses 1 through 3. Same language. Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion. What strength? You were taken into captivity. Put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city, for there shall no more come into you the uncircumcised and the unclean. Shake yourself from the dust and arise, as if they've been trampled on. Be seated, O Jerusalem. Loose the bonds from your neck, O captive daughter of Zion. For thus says Yahweh, you were sold for nothing, and you shall be redeemed without money. They do not deserve redemption, do they? Yet God says, I will still freely redeem my people. And then you skip down to the impossible, unimaginable verse 7 of this chapter. Picture Jerusalem in ruins and smoke and dust and ashes. And yet there's this statement. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation. He says to Zion, your God reigns. I don't know how I'm supposed to take that message when Jerusalem's sitting in destruction. The temple has been plundered. There's nothing left. I mean, it's just gone, emptied, ruined. And this messenger comes and says, hey, guess what? Your God reigns. Yahweh's king. I don't know how I'm supposed to receive that as the leftovers in Jerusalem. That seems utterly confusing. How can God be king? How can God redeem his people? Look at the political situation. And what did Isaiah mean when he said, a voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way for Yahweh. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. What does all this mean? And we're going to look at that this coming Sunday morning. Obviously, Christ will be that answer. God poured out his wrath on Judah, and we deserve the same cup of wrath because of our sin. And yet our high priest stands the gap. Jesus prayed to his Father in the garden, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Jesus knew he would bear the wrath of God. For our sake, the Father made the Son to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. I was thinking about really the deity of Jesus, obviously this morning with George's sermon in Colossians 1. I was like, Jesus took the wrath of God. The only one who can take the wrath of God, make atonement for sins, and rise from the dead would be God himself. We're going to see him this Sunday morning. If you have any needs at this congregation, whether there be prayers, you need to commit your life to this King, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.